This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagen. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right, where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals. And if you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives, with the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. All right. Welcome back to the pod, Ben Connelly, resident Richmond?
Charlottesville.
Oh, right. My gosh. Oh, my gosh. Charlottesville, let's see, greatest city outside of, where would I rank it? Man, in terms of my enjoyment per day of all the places I've ever lived, Charlottesville would have to be at the top. Because, obviously I was there for law school. Oh man, it was a very fun 3 years. It's a delightful place.
Well, we're under about 8 inches of ice right now, but under normal circumstances, yeah, it's a great place to live.
It's funny being from Utah, but one of the biggest snowstorms I've ever been in my life was in Charlottesville. My first year in law school, a few of us had come back, and it was like right at the start of second semester, first year, second year, but it was, yeah, everything was completely buried. Like, it just buried. I don't. This would have been about a decade ago, but you ended up with there on is it 29, where you have the Kroger and the Harris Teeter. There were mountains
Yes.
of snow, like it felt like 20 feet high, that they just piled up so they could make room for the cars. That stayed there for like a month because they're like little glaciers that were too big to melt. Um, anyway, that aside, welcome back. It's kind of funny. How would you characterize yourself? Because I know why I wanted to talk to you again. Obviously we recorded the podcast last. It might have been 8 months ago, something like that. I know why I wanted to have you on again. Why? How would you advertise yourself? Why do you think you're? Yeah. What do you bring to the Substack conversation? What do you bring to the podcast world, so to speak?
Sure. So I would characterize myself as a writer. That's in bios on pieces I've written, I tend not to add much more beyond that. I'll say I'm a writer and long distance runner living in Virginia. I have two Substacks. The primary one is called Hardihood Books. That's where I write short stories. I'm serializing a novel on long distance running actually at the moment. I just started that this month, and usually publish a couple of essays. And then I have a somewhat pseudonymous, although I do make it clear what my real name is. Second Substack called Carrying the Fire, where I write about politics from a um, fusionist, Reaganite, Buckleyite, Thatcherite, conservative perspective, which um, is it's a distinct minority these days. When vast majority of folks on the right are um, either MAGA, or they're some variety of nationalist or post-liberal or what have you. And certainly on the left, um, uh, wide spectrum from center left folks such as yourself to progressives to self-described socialists like Zoran Mamdani.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I uh, make the case for things in which I believe on that Substack. And um, the main thing I'm doing is I'm trying to add another voice that's on the right, that's not in that post liberal nationalist vein, and that is critical of Trump, because I think there's a growing perception, especially among young people and especially among people who are um, newer to politics or don't aren't paying as much attention, that that is all that's out there,
Mm.
and I find that concerning.
That is really interesting. That's a great introduction, and I think that's a more articulate version of what I would have said. Why I wanted to have you on. I think you are a highly you're a highly coherent exponent of what it, I think could be called traditional conservatism from a certain perspective. But I like that you called it a fusionist conservatism with Buckleyite, Reaganite, and Thatcherite kind of influences. How so? In what way would you say that and I don't even really know what the kind of popular conception of traditional conservatism would be, but what would you say you're getting from the Buckleyite umbrella, the Reaganite umbrella, the Thatcherite umbrella?
So a clarification: I actually meant those terms as synonyms.
Okay. Okay.
Not when I say as synonyms with fusionist, sort of giving some people a few figures to
Yeah.
anchor
Okay.
themselves. Ronald Reagan, William F. Buckley Jr., and Margaret Thatcher. Give people a bit of an idea of what I'm talking about, because the word conservative is um, difficult to pin down, especially these days. And traditional conservative, again, too difficult to pin down. Um, if we say, generally speaking, what the Republican Party more or less stood for about 40 years ago, a lot of
Yeah.
people understand that a little better. But once you get too into these debates, you find that um, there have been long, thoughtful, sometimes not so thoughtful, sometimes you very um, vitriolic debates over the meaning of um, all of these terms: traditional, conservative, who's a Republican, what does it mean to be right wing, and so at a certain point, uh, it's yes, I think traditional conservative is a great term, but I think there are some who would be confused if I just said that.
Yeah.
Fusionist refers to the term, actually, I think not coined by Frank Meyer, but often attributed to um, him for uh, a vision. He was a writer at National Review when it first launched under Buckley, and Meyer's job was essentially to articulate the philosophy behind the magazine. Buckley was out making the connections and making things happen, and um, Meyer was doing a lot of the intellectual grunt work. And the original idea was a fusion between um, virtue and tradition on the one side and liberty on the other, um, which Meyer argued was a long tradition throughout Western civilization. This wasn't something he invented in 1955.
Hmm.
Um, but it was also the intellectual counterpoint to Buckley's work trying to unite two factions on the right, the libertarians and the traditionalists, who talk a lot about morality and virtue, and often were at odds with the libertarians. And Meyer is arguing they have something in common.
Yeah. That okay, man. I'll tell you. I mean, a really short uh, explanation of why I like having you on here is that you know a lot of stuff I don't. And so it's really nice to have you on to explain stuff. And and I'm familiar with a lot of the names and the general gists, but I certainly don't have the depth of knowledge you do. Would and I was thinking on the way home from work about this. Part of why I think it matters to have you on here and to listen to you talk about some of what's happening currently is that you do offer this more uh, traditional conservative fusionist, whatever we want to call it. You offer this point of view that I think is anchored more in. theory and long tradition than a lot of than say like where a particular political party in this instance, the Republican Party stands at a particular moment, because the parties, the Republican and Democratic parties have dominated for a long, long time, but they have not stayed in one spot on one issue or another, and that's for multiple reasons. One, because they just straight up move, and then also because situations arise that we haven't really encountered before, and now you have to interpret that through whatever your lens is, and you can kind of move that way. Um, but well, and then I was thinking that there's an argument that uh, there's a deeper corpus of serious conservative philosophy and thought that there is on the liberal side. And I'm not sure that's true, but I could tell you off the top of my head names like Burke, and then the economic thinkers of the mid-century, and Hayek and whatnot, where there's a there are a lot of conservative thinkers that I think people could point to, whereas in the liberal side, I'm not sure they'd point to specific philosophers so much as um, I don't even know. I'm not sure. I was thinking for myself, maybe like Catholic social gospel stuff. That there are certainly various thinkers who have been on the left historically, but I don't know of as many left side political philosophers that are not serious leftists. Where like the serious philosophers of the middle, I'm not as familiar with them. I don't know if they exist.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of thoughts on that. One, in part by their nature, I don't think this is really the uh, reason that the big divide, but oftentimes the right is to some extent looking backward a little bit, and the
Mm,
left is to some extent looking forward, or at least claiming to. The left is more interested in progress, and the right's more interested in tradition and history, and so very often on the right, there is more of an interest in intellectual history and who are invoking the old names and tracing the development of our ideas. And there's more of an interest in continuity. And the left, there's more of an excitement about progress and an excitement about having a hard break with the past. The left is also more given to um, uh, sort of killing or having a rethink of previous left wing heroes, previous heroes on the left. Often later generations view them as horribly backwards in some way or another. You know, whether it was Woodrow Wilson and many of his contemporaries being involved in um, some of them, racist in the South, others involved in the
hmm
eugenics movement. They recently renamed um, what used to be called Alderman Library at UVA. They renamed it Shannon Library because it turned out Alderman, who was at the time was considered a progressive. He was friends with Woodrow Wilson, was a big figure in the eugenics movement. So
Ah.
um, the left is more given to um, uh, forgetting about or intentionally distancing itself from the past.
Yeah.
Um, at the same time, I would say the other interesting thing is that um, a majority of intellectuals, certainly at least in the 20th century, the terms right and left have only been around, about 200, a little more than 200 years, 220, 230 or so uh, years. And certainly in the 20th century, um, a majority of intellectuals were on the left. Um,
hmm
and it was a minority. So it partly could be the fact that there were fewer of them, and so they became more prominent. Um, but yeah, if we're going to talk about, there are a wide range of um, further to the left, communist, socialist intellectuals, hard left, the origins of the original critical theorists and
hmm
all sorts of things, the original, um, queer theorists and gender feminist theorists. If we're going to talk about the center left, um, uh, liberal, tradition, you could point to, in the middle of the 20th century, um, they really did rule the roosts. You could look
Hmm.
at Arthur Schlesinger, Arthur
Mm.
Schlesinger, uh, Lionel Trilling. Who else would be? I think Schlesinger was the one who coined the term vital center. Um, there are a couple of other names there that are escaping me at the moment, but um, the intellectual heights in many ways, and especially the literary crowd too.
Mm.
Um, uh, and then the interesting thing about that is a lot of those names are less. A lot of people don't know the name Lionel Trilling today, even though he was
Hmm.
dominant in his day. Um, but the other interesting thing is that a lot of them were New York intellectuals,
Mm.
and some of the New York intellectuals then became conservatives, and became the first wave of neoconservatism. That was um, Norman Podhoretz, and of course
Mm.
Irving Kristol, and then others like that. But there were literary figures, Norman Mailer associated with that group in the center. And then on the subject of economics, um, you can point to Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, but then on the um, other side, you can look and see, Friedman. Who are they debating, right?
Right.
Keynes,
Right.
of course, Samuelson,
Mm.
Friedman. Let me think. Was it Samuelson? Yeah, Samuelson and Friedman had these dueling columns in, I
Oh
think it was
yeah.
like
Is it
Time
Newsweek
Magazine.
or something? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Newsweek or Time. Yeah, maybe it was Newsweek. And there were um, there were some others who were um, sort of because of the social circumstances of the time, pretended to be a little closer to the center than they were,
Mm.
and they
Right.
deeper down were more sympathetic to the USSR. Um,
Hmm.
but certainly, Keynes, the interesting thing was he liked the road to serfdom, and he complimented Hayek on that. And they have this, intense debate about economics, but
Yeah.
um, he certainly was not a man of the far left.
No, I didn't know that. I didn't know about his interactions with Hayek, but I think from what I have read, and there's obviously a lot more I do want to read, but he the way that his theories have been applied does not match with what the theories actually were. Like he would not have approved, I think, of what a lot of governments have done with his ideas or used his ideas to justify over the last 75ish 80ish years
Yes.
since ideas really came into vogue. Um, man, yeah, that's why I love having you on because you know a lot more than I do. Um, there, but I wanted to have you on at this specific time because I wanted to talk about a few things going on in current events. Uh, is A lot is happening. A lot feels in flux. It feels like one of those times that we've had, I think, more with Trump than anyone else in my memory and in my reading, where the government, led by the president, has taken a particularly strong position on something, and then, in the face of public pressure, shows some willingness to take a fairly different tack in short order. They're very responsive to, I think, certain kinds of public pressure. But the things that I wanted to discuss were first uh, you can pick your favorite word, but we'll call it the obtaining of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela and extraditing him to Brooklyn. Then Greenland, which is kind of related in a sense, but separate and distinct. And then and maybe in with some of the foreign policy, you can lump in intimations about Cuba and Iran, and then also want to get your take on what has been going on with ICE. You know, the protests in Minnesota. There've been 2 shootings in the last couple of weeks, and that's the area where I think uh, we'll see when the podcast comes out. So we're recording this Tuesday night at 7:30 Mountain, 9:30 Eastern, and it would probably come out in a couple of days. And by that point, who really knows what will have happened in Minnesota? Things really are shifting pretty quickly. So let's start with Venezuela. So from the fusionist conservative perspective, what were your initial thoughts when you heard that we'd gone in and had gotten Maduro?
Initially, I was very excited. I mean, uh, hawkish on foreign policy, especially when it comes to anti-communism. And Maduro was a bad guy, and uh, I thought at the time, okay, this is the beginning of we're going to have some sort of regime change, and obviously. The thing we will do is make sure that Maria Corina Machado or Mikado, um, yeah, I've heard people pronouncing it different ways,
Okay.
is installed as the next leader, or at the very least, her party is that she's brought back. Because she wasn't the one who won the last election. It was I don't remember his first name. His last name was Gonzalez.
Hmm.
Maybe Eduardo or Edmundo.
I think Edmund, something, Mr. Gonzalez, regardless.
Yes, yes. Um, and Then that didn't happen, and so that leaves it something more of a mixed bag. There's a few different angles. Um, Certainly, there's excitement at the prowess of the U.S. military, the fact that we could just go in there, and our Delta Force commandos were outnumbered, but very easily just disabled everybody. Went in, did kill a number of Cubans. Interestingly enough, were guarding
Hmm.
Maduro, and took him out. And so the show of force,
Hmm.
the um, this should strike fear into the hearts of people who would cross the United States of America, even China and Russia, because to be perfectly frank, China does not have the ability to do this. Um,
Hmm.
I think they could do it in a country where they already sort of run things. Some of the small countries around their border, they already sort of run things, but we don't run at things in Venezuela. Even with Trump sort of making noises like he's going to. And the fact that we were able to go in and take him out was extraordinary.
What
Uh,
when you say China can't do this, what do you mean?
um, if, say, Australia were a thorn in China's side, China couldn't send special operators into Australia and kidnap the Australian president.
Hmm.
I don't think they have the capability to pull that operation off. Um, Certainly they could attack, if it was simply a war of Australia against China, and for some reason the entire U.S. and NATO
We're
and didn't get involved on
just gonna
Australia's
watch.
side. I think China would win that, but um, China would still have a hard time invading Australia, um,
Hmm.
whereas we just flew in and took Maduro out. And one of the ways we did it is it turned out that we obtained the Havana syndrome device. Um, and That was an interesting um, finale, although it may not even be the final chapter, or another episode in the saga of this Havana syndrome device. Which for the last several years, every once in a while, you'd hear something about it, and it was always being used by American enemies. And then it turned out that we managed to get a hold of it. That was exciting. Um,
For the benefit of those who do not know what the Havana syndrome device is, what is the Havana syndrome device?
Diplomats and people working for diplomats in Havana, Cuba, and then also elsewhere around the globe. um, American diplomats reported headaches and confusion, some other
Mm.
symptoms of some sort of. It appeared to be an attack on the brain or the inner ear, um, some sort of sound device, and um, some people were saying this is just totally rumors. They're making it up. They're just getting sick from something else. And some of them have like long term symptoms. I think
Mhm.
didn't really fully recover in the same way that people have long COVID. Um, and it started happening around the world. People were saying, maybe that's related to Russian intelligence. Um, it appears to commonly happen when people are nearby to Russian. Um, Foreign offices, but
Mhm.
it was a bit of a mystery. Some people said it was a conspiracy theory, and then finally, the reporting after the Venezuela operation said that it was um, U.S. intelligence had um, done some sort of undercover deal posing as, I don't know, foreign agents and purchased it from some sort of arms dealer.
Mhm.
Um, and the arms dealers had connections to Russian intelligence, but the last that I read was that we don't think that it was originally developed by Russian intelligence, even as they probably had some hand in it. So
Hmm.
some third party,
Mhm.
um, arms, black market folks or something like that. Um, so you know, I I think that I'm not happy with the fact that we just left Delcy Rodriguez in place in Venezuela.
Mhm.
Um, already it sounds like, people were excited. The Venezuelan people were excited. They were flying U.S. flags. They were, you know, happy that Maduro was gone. It sounds like she started to crack down a little bit. Trump does this silly, we're just in it for the oil nonsense.
Yeah.
Um, Probably because, so many, he's heard so many, left wing critics say that for the years. Although I mean, going back to Iraq and Afghanistan, he had this thing about we should have just gone in and gotten the oil and got out of there.
Right. Mhm.
Um, and I will say, I think that I do think that the current regime will be afraid of us.
Mhm.
If we could get Maduro, we could go in and take out Rodriguez too. So I do think that they're going to be pretty cowed. Um, I hope that more is going to come. I don't know that it will. I don't know that it won't. Um, I certainly think Marco Rubio probably does not want this to be the end.
Yeah.
Um, Obviously, Machado came and just totally embarrassingly, like embarrassingly for her, but really embarrassingly for him, came and gave Donald Trump her Nobel Peace Prize, um,
Um,
which the Nobel Committee, as if they really even had to say this, said that the prize is non-transferable, um, and and he took it like a chump. Um, of course she's doing that because she wants his help and
Right.
um but there are the truth is that there are it's easier to take out someone like Maduro than it is to set up and ensure the safety of a new government. um
Right.
yes, Maduro was incredibly unpopular, um but there are still some elements of within the military there, and some of the drug related groups, although the Venezuela's role in the current drug crises here in the United States has been way overstated. They aren't involved in the fentanyl stuff at all, and most of the drugs they have, from what I have heard, are going actually to Europe. Um,
Mhm.
but there are uh, narco terrorists, if that's the word we're using, in Venezuela. There are other armed groups that, so it wouldn't be quite as simple as just giving Machado a plane
Right.
ticket and whatnot. But I think we could do more, and I hope that there's going to be more to come. Um, uh, so a mix of good and bad, I would say.
Well, so speaking of narco-terrorism, let's talk pretexts for a second, because um, so I want to know from your perspective what an acceptable pretext be, or what an ideal pretext would be. Because as I understand it, what the administration has said, perhaps it has offered three justifications that I can think of off the top of my head. There might have been more. Didn't read all the interviews. This has been talked about a great deal. Obviously, one of them is oil. I think that was kind of after the fact, and that is dubious to some extent. Anyway, there's this idea that by going in, we are limiting the drug flow into the United States. That is highly doubtful. I And then I can't remember. Oh, I forgot. I had one more, but one that makes a lot of sense to me, as far as being something that would send the Trump administration to do something like this. I'm not sure they've said it out loud, but that Venezuela has played a large role in contributing to the number of the groups of people that have come into the United States, or that came into the United States during the Biden administration. Since Maduro came into power in 2013, I think something hard to comprehend, like 8 million people have left Venezuela. Um, their economy has crumbled completely, and they've lost 8 million. Would be like a fifth of the population, or a quarter of the population. Some massive number have left Venezuela. Many of those people came up through the United States. Obviously, the Trump administration has made stopping that a major priority. Whether you agree with that or not, that is a pretty consistent priority for them. Uh, what do you? But you take a different perspective. You welcome, I think, regime change more on its own when it's this kind of regime. Uh, what What do you think? Is that fair?
Yes, I think I'd say that that's fair with some caveats. I think the administration has done a poor job of explaining the rationale. I think
Mhm.
there are um, they were justified in doing it. They didn't give a good job. They didn't do a good job of explaining it. I don't think that the narco terrorism angle is a good one. Although uh, that wasn't the only way in which Venezuela was a thorn in our side. It was becoming increasingly so. It is allied with our enemies, with
Mhm.
Iran and uh, China and Russia. And Maduro was, I don't know all of the particulars, but it was it was getting to the point where, to be honest, like if we hadn't done something now, I suspect that in a few years we would have been forced to.
Hmm.
That there would have been more of an obvious pretext, but I do think that the um, migration thing alone is a major factor because um, the numbers and the destabilizing effect that that has had on us, but also elsewhere throughout Central and America and Mexico, and the fact that yes, it was something like a fifth of the population had fled, and there was no indication that this was going to end. Um, so, and like it was at a scale to which it is beginning to have an effect on our country,
Hmm.
and uh, and the other thing is that we have, just as we have vital national interests around the globe, we have vital national interests in the um, South and Central America region, um, and I do think that sometimes we need to um, follow those interests. In the same way that I don't want to get into an argument necessarily about the Iraq War, but
Mm.
many people would say that in retrospect, people have said, "Oh, the reason we went in was WMDs." But the truth was, Saddam had already fought one with war with us. Um, his people were doing all kinds of things to, attack us, attack our interests, attack our allies. Um, in the region and elsewhere, he continued to be a thorn in our side for a long time, to the effect that if you look at late in the Clinton administration, um, sure, Clinton didn't invade Iraq in 1999, but Clinton was having to do more and more and more to deal with Saddam uh, in the Middle East, and Saddam was
Mhm.
continuing to be a problem for us and for our interests. And so I think Maduro, not to the same level as Saddam. I think Saddam actually um, gave us much more of a pretext
Mhm.
many times over. And many people would have said, H.W. Bush should have just gone in originally and
Mm.
first Gulf War, finished the job then, and because he didn't, then we had to go back in later. Some people would say that.
Mhm.
And so one argument with Maduro is he was becoming more and more of a problem. At a certain point, we were going to have to deal with him anyway.
Yeah. That truthfully, yeah, okay, makes sense. I can, yeah, that argument, uh, that argument tracks. Uh, with the, I wanted to go back to something you said earlier because I think this ties into talking about Greenland. Let's move on. But you talked about this as an important move to kind of show our strength. We have our Delta Force operators going there, and the CIA had been in the country for months already. It really was kind of incredible. Even from the bleeding heart liberal perspective, like reading this, like my gosh, these guys are good. Like whether you agree with it or not, it was whether you agree with what the team was doing or not, what the team did took immense skill and some luck, but just such intense planning and skill. Really, I think hats off to all those who were physically involved in the process. Um, but this idea that by doing things like this, you show strength on the international stage. You perhaps well, very likely put the new government of Delcy Rodriguez or the old government of Delcy Rodriguez in a position where they're going to kowtow to what we need. And you also put countries like China and Russia on notice that America is willing to act and is willing to act. Don't want to say without any provocation at all, but is willing to be a first mover in that sense. Um, I want to ask about that because Stephen Miller, I think, and I'll confess, I think Stephen Miller is the most noxious member of the Trump government, and that includes the president, includes everyone else. There are many people with whom I disagree vehemently, both in on what they believe and kind of who and how they are. But Miller is the top of the list, and it's by some margin. But he's, I believe, said stuff along the line of like only it's really just strength. Like that's what matters. Like the strong countries can do what they want. Weak countries aren't able to oppose them, and there really is a kind of a might makes right element to to what he says. And I would like your thoughts on that, especially as we move into talking about Greenland, where I think there's I think there's a bigger debate to be had about whether our interests are served by acquiring Greenland than in getting rid of Maduro.
Sure. So uh, I share a lot of that feeling about Stephen Miller. He's certainly one of the most loathsome figures in this administration. I think there's some truth. I know what he said. I think there's some truth to what he said, not all of it.
Hmm.
Um, where there's truth is, I do think in the international order um, does resemble Hobbes's War of All Against All, where it's a jungle, life is nasty, brutish, and short. Um, poor, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That said, I don't believe that might makes right. I believe that the proper application of I believe something closer to um, the good guys need to be stronger than the bad guys, because otherwise the bad guys will do what they want. Um, and since the end of the Second World War, um, the strength of the United States has kept the peace in the world. There was a good article. I don't remember who it was by. It was a guest contribution in the Dispatch recently about the end of the liberal international order, and um, it pointed out that there was this sort of um, fiction behind the international order, um, which it sort of worked because people knew it, um, never people liked it. And
Mhm.
the fiction was that that there was this thing called a liberal international order, and we're all sort of equal and jointly committed to Kant's future in which there's no more war and there's international peace and all of that. Um, and the reality was that um, the United States ensured that there was peace and order. Um, and not simply through total just force domination, but also through alliances. That our strength was the reason that those alliances continued to be successful and were so successful and it wasn't and the fact was that the United States was strong, but the United States was a good country. That for all of our flaws and the mistakes we made in including in that period. Um, we were a good country, and because of that, and that we were something new and this is something I truly believe. It was something new in the history of the world, which was that it did used to be true that the strongest powers always just sort of um, took for themselves. And it used to be they were just totally blatant about it. And sometimes they did have some sort of ideal that they tried to uphold, including
Mhm.
Athens, including Rome, including the British Empire. Um, but oftentimes they did a lot more plundering, and the United States really was a little bit more. Yes, we made mistakes. We didn't always do the right thing, um, including during that period. But a little bit more like the cliche about how we whip our enemies in battle and then we give them the shirt off our backs. The fact that we liberate Europe and we lost so many people doing that, and we never took, and then we used our own money to rebuild Europe,
Mhm.
uh, and the fact is that we did. Yes, I shared a lot of the complaints about NATO. Our allies are sort of relying on us, and they're not paying their fair share. But it was true that the NATO alliance existed so that we would protect Europe from the Soviet Union, and we did. Um,
Mhm.
and then the fact is that our allies were not freeloaders. Um, they appreciated that, and they got our backs. When the only time Article 5 was ever actually invoked was when we were attacked on 9/11, and they did come to our aid, and they fought alongside us in the Middle East and lost um, soldiers. And our NATO allies were not simply freeloaders, but to zoom back out for just a second, my part of my larger perspective as a hawk, I'm not either. I hesitate to use the word neoconservative because people don't know what it means. But what people think
Mhm.
it means is something akin to um, the second Bush administration and nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a sort of idealistic, almost Wilsonian foreign policy. Um,
Mhm.
I certainly don't share that. I do have more of, I hate to use the term realist because that can mean so many different things, but a little bit more of a hard headed view. At the same time, I do believe that morality should play a role in um, it shouldn't be the only consideration, but we should intentionally choose to ally with free countries and um,
Mm.
in part because they want to ally with us, and the authoritarian countries always want to, well, almost always, with a few exceptions. Saudi Arabia wants to ally with us, but
Mhm.
Venezuela, Iran, these people choose to be our enemies. Russia chooses to be our enemy. China, we've tried to be their friend, and they choose to be our enemy.
Mhm.
Um, and I'll use another a term I definitely am is a primacist. Um, and what that means is that I believe U.S. foreign policy should be focused on um, the goal of having a unipolar world in
Mhm.
which we are dominant. It's a better world for us and for our interest. It's also better for the world because we have been so benign, relatively speaking, and it makes for a better world. And in part because our strength allows, um, we keep some of the smaller wars from happening.
Mm.
We allow some of these small countries who are afraid of each other, but they don't actually go to war because we're there, because they don't have to be as afraid as they would in a world in which there's no um, global policeman. And sure, we shouldn't always just try to be the global policeman, but we do keep, we maintain in the way that the British Navy maintained the freedom of the high seas. We're the reason that there's able to be, and yes, Britain still helps us, Australia helps us, Japan helps us, our allies help us, South Korea helps us. um, so it isn't simply our navy, but if our navy were to disappear tomorrow, um, we would go back to an older order in which piracy was much more common,
Mm.
and global trade was not as we take it for granted these days.
Right.
Um, and we take for granted the peace that there can be in some of these far flung regions where there are groups who would like to do more harm to some of the nations around them, but they don't because our navy sails through every once in a while, and maybe has a base there, and maybe every once in a while does a humanitarian relief project, or even just stops and has a port call, and we trade flags with the locals and whatnot. But
Yeah.
uh, we don't have to do a lot. But I in my perspective, having a naval presence around the world um, is better for the world, and maintaining our primacy on the high seas um, is important. And one of the reasons that to go all the way back to the beginning, that
Yeah.
it's important to sometimes show strength and to show force is to prove that um, there is something backing up this primacy on the high seas, and to keep people from trying, so to keep bad people from trying something. Um,
Mhm.
and if we always roll over, more people will try to poke the bear. More people will try to push us more and more. And sometimes we need to show that we mean business. Um,
Mhm.
and in recent years, I think we have, in some cases, um, allowed too much or rolled over too much. And there were certainly people around the world who were becoming emboldened. Um, and so having this operation will cause some groups to think twice about um, attacking us.
Yeah. Maybe, yeah, maybe so, a different formulation, might be that might enables right or right needs might.
Yes.
Something along those lines. Um, so so that takes us to Greenland, okay? Because what we're doing there seems a little different than what the U.S. has done before. How do you feel about our efforts to acquire Greenland?
Yeah. So Greenland, I'm ashamed. As an American, I'm ashamed. It's shameful. Um, it's embarrassing. Um, and yes, Donald Trump has. It sounds like he's backed down, and
Yeah.
supposedly we're getting something which, from the sound of it, isn't really that different from the status quo 2 or 3 years
Yeah.
ago on Greenland.
Yeah. So my understanding of this going in is basically whatever we want to do there, Denmark lets us do. Like if we want to build, like we could build gigantic bases. We could move the entire U.S. military there. And I'm not saying it would be a good idea, but we could move, 1,000,000 soldiers there, and they would let us do that,
Yes,
from my understanding.
what we can't do is some of the exploitation of rare earth minerals, some of the mining
Got it.
that I think we would like to do. I don't know if in this new agreement we're going to be able to do more of that. Um, but Denmark, due to different priorities on the climate than, say,
Mm.
America, Denmark doesn't want some of that mining done. Um, so, yeah, it was interesting that in a plane flight shortly after nabbing Maduro, um, Trump was being interviewed by some reporters, and one of them asked him about Greenland, and he said something like, "You're bringing up Greenland right now. What's wrong with you?" But then, about a week later, he was the one bringing up Greenland, and it was it was embarrassing. I mean, it was the text that he sent uh,
Yeah.
to Norway's prime minister,
Yeah.
and uh, his whole thing about how he didn't win the Nobel Prize and he was upset. And part of me wonders, is this why he hasn't given Machado more help in Venezuela? Is it that he's upset that he didn't win the Nobel Prize and she did? Um, and then he gave an interview where a reporter asked him about how is this in the interest of the United States, and he said something about how it's psychological and it's because psychologically he needs it. And this isn't an original to me, but he's a real estate developer. Here's this huge big piece of land. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think he thinks much further beyond that.
See, that's funny because I'm very close with a number of people who voted for Trump. I'm close with people who didn't just vote for him because they didn't like Harris or Biden or whatever, but because they like him. They like his policies, they like what he's done. But what makes Trump such a difficult figure, and what makes this whole political period so difficult, is that even where there is a coherent justification for whatever the government is doing, and even where it has some precedent, either like a direct and obvious precedent or an arguable precedent, his involvement makes everything seem different. And it's much harder. Like, you could plausibly fit Venezuela and Iran and Cuba and Russia and China and maybe even Greenland's it's a big stretch no matter how you look at it, really, but you could fit it all into some coherent theory of foreign policy. But then you juxtapose that with conversations where where he's kind of giving these freewheeling interviews, and it basically seems like he's like, there's some of it that requires a lot of forethought, and then some of it's like, what? And they just kind of go for it. And it makes, yeah, I mean, it's going to be there are a lot of people, and actually it'd be interesting your thought on this. There are a lot of people who see this as the end of the liberal and international order, or the order enabled by the United States, however you want to define it, uh, and think that our relationships with our allies will be permanently changed. And they might all be right, but I'm hesitant to agree wholeheartedly that anything is going to permanently change when the particular person in charge is so generationally idiosyncratic. Like, there is no one like Donald Trump on the right or the left. There's no one exactly like him. And those who have kind of tried to model themselves after him tend to fall well short, because he's legitimately a charismatic figure who has inspired a very large following, whereas some of his more, I don't know if we want to call them Trumpy acolytes who have run for office, a lot of them have really not done well without his help, and even with his help, it haven't done nearly as well as he has. Um, yeah, I don't know. It makes it all kind of weird.
Right. So it remains to be seen what will happen next. I think that a lot of um, we can. It's hard to predict the future. The next couple of administrations that come after this will probably set a lot in terms of um, how these curtain events are interpreted. I do think there's something to what you're saying with he's such an idiosyncratic figure that foreign governments and foreign populations, once he's gone, they may go, you know what? We recognize that in the case of the Greenland thing, I think the polling was something like 90-10 against, or at least 80-20. I mean, it's like even most Trump voters were like, this is a dumb idea.
I
What
will say
he's
to
doing
Trump's
is.
credit, when he gets he doesn't, maybe he doesn't believe polls with the same fervor that your average liberal campaign strategist would, but he does react to things where there's like an 80-20 split. He's like, all right, yeah, let's yeah, we'll flip that around and see if I can save face.
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah, and I think
Yeah, that's
part of
to
it
his
is
credit. That's a very soft. Sorry to interrupt. It's a very soft to his credit. It's a
r-
very, very, very soft. Almost kind of sarcastic. Carry on.
right. Um, he has a certain celebrity appeal, and so some people
Mm,
will stick with him no matter what he does. But you're right, other people can't get away with the same things. Um, I do think that I do worry that some of the damage that he's doing, we won't be able to undo it. But I don't know. You know, the future is a long time, and um, in my experience, most of the foreigners I've met, with some exceptions, have had more perspective on Trump. They just have more distance to it,
mm,
and they're like, yeah, um, uh, you know, they sort of they get it. They don't necessarily like him, but they're like, well, you know, he's one leader. He's, you know, he's kind of brash. He's the way he is, but um, they don't necessarily write off America based on every little thing Donald Trump does.
right,
Um, and there are some exceptions to that. Definitely some exceptions to that. And there definitely are a lot more um, people around the world who are angry not just at Donald Trump but at America, including
right,
many of our former allies, in part because of the level of some of the insults that it isn't just you know, the Canada's our 51st state. That's funny, but then when he starts talking about how, well, our allies have never had our backs, um, then you have people who are um, in every other respect, they are, you know, foreigners who love America, and they're upset because you just insulted their war dead, who fought alongside us in our Afghanistan and Iraq and were killed. And
hmm,
there were a lot of those. Um, the other thing is, I will say that Trump isn't the first. There's been a line of, you know, Biden pulling out of Afghanistan. Not everybody knows the fact that he kind of, or his administration bungled um, letting our allies know when and where the logistics of how we were getting out. And so, some cases, some of our allied troops who were in Afghanistan at the time were left holding the bag or suddenly found themselves. It was like we're allies, and then oh, we're bugging out, and everybody's on their own. And I think a lot of people were upset about that. Even though
yeah,
yes, it was telegraphed in advance, you could say, but uh, there was such a poor job of coordination there. I think that left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. Um, and I think you know, other things like the AUKUS, or you know, AU K US deal, the Australia
mm,
and UK US deal. We did snub the French pretty bad when we did that, and that was under the Biden administration, in a way that
hmm,
was really wholly uncalled for. And there have been other snubs in the past, and so I wonder what's going to happen going forward. It does bother me that more and more of our allies are becoming warmer towards China and
right,
in some cases Russia, because of um, what we've been doing. I even another a perfect example of that from say about 10 years ago was pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If our goal had been to isolate China, actually having a free trade deal with all these countries in the region and not China would have been perfect. But instead, by
Yeah.
pulling out, we forced them. Those countries, they're all so close to China that if they're not trading heavily with us, they have to trade heavily with China. So we
Right.
force them into China's hands, and uh, China can totally dominate them um, economically and
Hmm.
militarily. And so I do think that there is being a lot of damage done. I don't know what will happen next. Is the quote liberal international order unquote going away? Is it going to be here in a new form? What's going to happen? I am a little skeptical of the spheres of influence. Oh, we're moving into a period where there's going to be totally
Mm.
just um, China gets its sphere, Russia gets its sphere, we get our sphere. The
Yeah.
reason I'm skeptical of that is that China is facing a demographic cliff pretty soon. So in
Hmm.
10 years, I don't know that China can have a sphere. Um, Russia having a sphere is kind of a joke because they can't even take Kyiv 4 years later, and the only countries they can push around are Belarus and Moldova and Georgia. Uh,
A country, yeah, small countries on their borders.
right. I mean,
Yeah.
even Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, um, they can't push
Right.
around.
Yeah.
So
Let me ask you one last question because I don't want to keep you too late. Um, Given you're on the East Coast, let's. I and by the way, I what I can't remember every single thing you said, so I don't want to give just a a blanket. I agree with everything you said, although I think I agree with everything you said. But either I agree with everything you said, or it was very interesting, and I'll have to think about it. But yeah, yeah, fascinating stuff. Yeah, we're gonna see a lot of stuff over the next few years, and I do fully agree with you on I think some of Biden's mistakes. I think I think one of the frustrating things that liberals have to contend with right now is that you lost to this guy. The Clinton one 2016. The popular vote went for Hillary, and so that one you always have to kind of bring up that caveat when you're saying that you lost to him twice, because the first time she did, she had the 3 million vote advantage in the popular vote, but definitely lost to him once pretty hard. And so every time he's doing something nuts, you have to remember that a lot of people saw the available options and thought, you know what? Like having already seen a term of this guy, let's run it back because that is preferable to the alternative. And and I think there are a lot of people on the left who like to think that that just means that half the country is stupid or evil. Obviously there are a lot of people on the right who think that about the left as well. But it's just even if that is the case, you got to figure out a way to persuade more stupid and evil people to, to support your candidates, or it's not going to work. Yeah. So, one last point. So, let's try and spend just a few minutes. I want to hear your thoughts on ICE and Minnesota.
yes, so you bring up a very good point on Democratic Party lost to Trump once, and that's the perfect tie-in actually for the Minneapolis thing, which is that I heard just today, and I haven't looked at the polling myself, so this could be wrong. Um,
Hmm.
what I heard was that um, uh, even after all of this, the Democrats still poll worse than Donald Trump on this subject of immigration. Um,
Eesh.
Now, I think with some caveats. One of
Mm.
that is that this is another issue which could approach 90-10. A lot of people, I think, including in Trump's base, I think, are turning on him. Americans don't like there is this sort of latent. Um, Libertarian is probably a little bit of a stretch, but a latent, freedom loving character in America.
Hmm.
Americans don't like this image of ICE. That said, they don't necessarily love the protesters on the other side either. Um,
Right.
but the um, Trump administration has been clearly overplaying its hand, and they recognize that. I mean, you opened by
Hmm.
saying events are moving rapidly here. It appears that um, Nome is out and Homan is in, and um, that might mean we'll get more competent immigration enforcement and less of theatrics uh, and people are I would say this does, I think, have the potential to move strongly against the Trump administration in a way that the stuff in LA or the stuff in DC, the National Guard, didn't,
Hmm.
because um, it does look a little bit more like um, this is a clown show. These guys, these ICE guys, don't know what they're doing.
Hmm.
And we had these two tragic shootings, and there are people saying extreme things on both sides, um, and we have both a tradition of um, innocent and proven till proven guilty, and we need to have a trial and investigate, and also a sense that um, in both cases it's tragic that this person, one woman, Renee Good, and one gentleman, Alex Preddy, that they shouldn't have had to lose their lives, and they didn't
Hmm.
deserve to. And anyone saying, there's a few people in the Trump supporting MAGA media sort of saying these people had it coming to them, and that's sick, and that's just totally wrong. It's very sad. In the case of Good, she's driving a car, and that does, I think, change things where it's hard for me to see how that officer doesn't get off, because a car is such a dangerous weapon. Um, and a lot of
Hmm.
people don't think of it. Oh, we drive in our cars every day, and yet, um, I think I have the same kind of car as that woman was driving. It can go from 0 to 60 very quickly,
Yeah.
so it can be a dangerous weapon. That said, I don't necessarily think that she was trying to um, kill that agent, but he reacted quickly in the moment, and in the way our system currently exists, the tie goes to the law enforcement officer. In the case of Alex Preddy, they had disarmed him. Yes, he had a gun, but they disarmed him. That one's a little more clear cut to me. Um, and I think it's a little more clear cut to a lot of people. And the
Hmm.
other thing that's upsetting people is the fact that the administration's come out and made all this um, noise about how, oh, he shouldn't have been carrying a gun, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's upset a lot of gun rights activists, and normally who would be sort of on the side of the administration. Um, so I think um, that the public is turning against ICE and the enforcement tactics, especially since they haven't just been, if they were just going after the violent criminals and
Yeah.
drug dealers, or even if they were just going after illegal aliens, and not the fact that they're going after random immigrants, they're saying, oh, we'll revoke this person's green card, or even they've gone after Hispanic or Asian or Middle
Right.
Eastern or Black Americans who were American citizens, and said, "Oh, you speak Spanish? Are you illegal?" And Americans don't like that. The
Yeah.
and the few who do are a problem, and so ISIS. But at the same time, the other side does have the potential to continue to hand Trump wins, in the sense that people also don't like to see rioting in the streets. They don't like
Yeah.
to see protests that turn violent. They don't like to see people who intentionally provoke law enforcement into doing something that seems harsh and brutal. Um, and I think on the activist side of the Democratic Party, there are a lot of people who are spoiling for a fight, who want to fight.
Yeah.
And that's dangerous. We could have um, more of these tragic incidents. Um,
Hmm.
we could have more violence. And that also has the potential to people like if there's rioting in the streets and law enforcement comes and puts that down, people actually like that kind of thing pulls pretty well. That side
Yeah.
of the sort of law and order enforcement of the Trump administration polls pretty well in the same way that him shutting down the border, that polls very well.
Yeah.
I think what people are objecting to is that it doesn't seem like law and order, it seems like lawlessness and disorder by this sort of rogue agency, and that's what people don't like. They would like it if these people looked a little more professional and acted a little more professional.
Yeah, I think that leads in nicely to something I think I actually wrote in June during the LA protests. I think people generally don't like disruption,
Hmm.
which means that they like the rule of law and efforts to maintain the rule of law. They don't particularly like protests. They're willing to support efforts to enforce immigration law, but then they don't like, you know, raids in communities where you're taking out members of the community. You're not, if you take up, someone in your community happens to be a murderer, sure, you're willing to give that person up. But if it's someone who like owns a corner store and whose kids are on the soccer team or whatever, much less inclined to go along with that, especially if the people doing that are wearing masks and, dressed like they're about to go into Venezuela to take out Maduro. And, it's a different scale of things. It plays less well. And to um, to go back to this idea that Americans don't like, um, kind of this federal government, this sort of overreach. I think I agree. I think that really is fundamental. I don't like saying Americans are a certain way and, Brits are a certain way and people from Sierra Leone are this way. But I do think, you look to our founding documents, you look at the Constitution, you look at the Bill of Rights, and people think of the Bill of Rights and they're like, yeah, okay, sets out individual rights. Those are things we care about. Think about what it's actually doing. It's limiting the government. First Amendment, the government is not allowed to interfere. Obviously, all these have been interpreted by courts, and they don't necessarily mean exactly what you might think they mean based on the written text. But the government can't limit your right to speak or assemble or practice your religion or your non-religion. Second Amendment, government can't, again within certain court prescribed limits, limit your right to keep a gun. Third Amendment, you can't be forced to shelter soldiers in your home, which seems less relevant now, but was pretty relevant when it was drafted. Fourth Amendment, search and seizure. Fifth Amendment, right against self-incrimination. Sixth Amendment, due process. Seventh Amendment, right to a jury trial. So the government can't do it all on its own. Like if it's going to convict you of a crime, they have to get your peers in, and they have to agree you're guilty. Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. Ninth is kind of the catch-all. Like, just so you know, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list of rights and remedies. There may be more limitations on the government. And then 10th, it's like anything we didn't specifically give to the feds goes to the state governments. Like those are really serious, codified, not just codified, like codified in our founding documents, in our founding document, limitations on what the government can do. And though I think both parties, I won't say all theories of political thought, because I think that there are differences obviously between conservatism and republicanism, and then liberalism and demo- democratism, whatever. Um, I think Republicans and Democrats, by and large, tend to be pretty okay with a large federal government in certain respects. But I think while they have their own ways of defining this, they do not like interferences with individual liberty. there are big disagreements on what that means, but I think people generally speaking would say they do not like that. Um, a couple of final thoughts from me on this. The hard thing with protests and with having a bunch of um, federal agents with guns around is that these are just they're risky situations. You know that is what it is. So like you absolutely have the right to protest, and I think protests can be very good, and they can get a you know it's a fundamental American right, and that often is basically the only way available that people have to make their voices heard until the next time an election comes around. And but then at the same time, when you are protesting, you're coming into close quarters with armed agents of the federal, state, or local government. Uh, Everyone involved is human, and you are going to, you have these, these potentially fiery interactions, close quarters, and it's it's almost surprising to me that we have as few incidents as we do when you have people with such strong feelings and who may be armed, are coming into close contact so frequently. Um, and the last thing, there is this refrain primarily from conservative. Well, no, sorry, the refrain came from the left, but then the mocking it came from the right. But this idea during 2020 of mostly peaceful protests, and the thing is, it's like these protests absolutely were mostly peaceful. Referring back to 2020, like the most of the people who attended had peaceful intentions and did peaceful things. But a mostly peaceful protest is not it's not going to be seen as a peaceful protest. With protests and with law enforcement, you kind of have to get it 100%, or it just does, or that like the story is going to be about the 1%. So if ICE is going to say, we've had all these interactions with people, and we've had, like all it takes is two officers doing a dumb, wrong thing, whether it was dumb, whether they reacted reasonably in a very tense moment, or whether they acted murderously, is everyone is going to have their opinions about that. And that is something that I think will be adjudicated. And we'll have some well publicized trials where we get to talk about that a lot more. But regardless, uh, those two things those color everything ICE is doing, and that's just the name of the game. With certain sorts of things, you kind of have to bat 1,000.
Right. I think Ben Shapiro said about the mostly peaceful thing that O.J. Simpson was mostly peaceful and that one fateful night. So yeah, I mean, it's like violence is often quick and brief, and it may
Right,
only involve a relatively small number of people, and yet it has an outsized impact. Um,
right.
and I mean, I don't know on that the Third Amendment, the way things are going with this administration. We'll see. We may need that. We may need
We might finally have a reason to litigate that.
right, right. Um, yeah, and the last thing I was going to say is that you know, when Martin Luther King was uh, and his followers were preparing to do some of their protests, they trained to and vetted people to make sure that they weren't going to um, get into an altercation, that people
Hmm.
could live up to the nonviolent, and because they recognized it's going to be really hard to
Yeah,
sit there and get slapped in the face and not start a fight.
yeah,
And so most people haven't done that. So yeah, it's really hard. Tensions are high and people's emotions are out of control. Um, I I hope that the changes that happened today and that will continue hopefully in the next couple of days will sort of tone things down in Minneapolis, and that
yeah.
we don't see a repeat of 2020 in terms of the um, violence and riots and shootings and that this is the last of ICE shooting anybody, uh,
Yeah.
hopefully, but it remains to be seen.
Yeah. I'll end with this just because it'll bug you. I hope I hope Democrats do not just the right thing here, but do react in a way that is going to work in the long run politically. Because I think it's difficult during the Trump era, and many Trump fans I think don't understand this the same way. But if you hate Donald Trump, and I think, or maybe it's a strong word for some and it's a weak word for others. Uh, if you are already opposed to everything he's doing, like he can be a very easy person to dislike strongly, and you end up forming an entire platform that is just all you're doing is trying to mirror and do the exact opposite of whatever it is that he does, and that's not a particularly effective way to do things. As we have seen, I think looking back, and as hopefully people will remember going forward. Anyway, Ben Connelly, has been awesome having you on. Sorry it's a little late and cold in Charlottesville. Um, yeah, this was awesome. I love having you on. It's a treat for me to get someone on who is so articulate and so knowledgeable about these subjects in a way, and in a way that I'm not, and from a perspective that for which I certainly don't have the same background. So thank you again. Thank you again for coming on.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the kind words. This is a lot of fun for me too.
All right, and that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes, or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.